Throughout our discussions of Indigenous issues in Canada, one of the things that we've been sort of talking about is the challenge that is posed by urban Indigenous people. In that it doesn't really respond to sort of the same treaty structure, the same reserve structure. That just doesn't work when we start talking about urban Indigenous people for a variety of reasons. What I want to do sort of now in this video is sort of take another tactic at looking at what those contemporary negotiations might look like by focusing on a pretty local example that's really, really recent. So we're going to talk a little bit about this idea about Camp Pekiweiwin from this summer. For those of you who are not familiar, this is an encampment that was built near the old Rossdale power plant, near a baseball stadium this summer, that sort of aimed to house and provide a certain number of services to the homeless population in Edmonton that had been living in Edmonton's River Valley, and to sort of call attention to the challenges of sort of dealing with homelessness and poverty and other sorts of issues in Edmonton during this time of COVID. It was relatively recently dismantled because of the promise of sort of shelter spaces throughout the winter, but I'm going to talk about it anyway, because in a lot of ways, this is an example of one of the challenges of dealing with Indigenous issues in Canada right now, which is that it actually touches on a really wide range of sort of levels of government and ways of approaching this sort of question. So, in a formal sense, relationships with Indigenous people fall to the federal government. But in practice, this becomes an issue that affects provincial governments, that affects municipal governments, that affects sort of even individual companies in different spaces and different environments because of the scope of the question. So, for example, when we talk about Camp Pekiweiwin, the argument coming from some of the organizers there was that this was a prayer camp, that this was sacred space, and that it was inappropriate for the city of Edmonton to own what was, for example, Indigenous sacred space and use it in a way that was essentially just allocated for overflow parking for baseball. And that was inappropriate, and that what the appropriate thing for the city to do was to return an amount of that, was to return that land to Indigenous people to allow them to build some kind of gathering place. And there was not a whole lot of agreement initially, that was by design, about what that would look like, because the idea was that the city would commit the land and a certain amount of funding to, for example, build and develop on that land, such as it is. And then the city would enter into consultations with, for example, Indigenous groups and elders to have a conversation about, hey, what might we put here that would be meaningful for you? Is this going to be some kind of permanent structure? Are we going to look at spaces for sacred fires? Are we going to look at like what sort of things make sense in this space and in your community life and that sort of space? What I will say is that this example of Camp Pekiweiwin also gives us some very sort of contemporary and very relevant examples and some understanding of how this becomes different, and how these issues in terms of Indigenous negotiation and reconciliation more broadly become very, very complicated, and very difficult to actually navigate. Okay, because over the summer, if you were following the news around this, one of the things that you would probably have seen would be some commentary about it's illegal camping. And if I couldn't camp illegally in the River Valley, neither should these people. The city should show up and ship them out. And the only reason they're not is because these people are claiming to be Indigenous and they're not really Indigenous anyway. So there was a lot of that sort of doubt about the authenticity of the idea that this was Indigenous land and that this was a prayer camp and that this had anything to do with anything other than these are people who are homeless. There was some challenge about the overlap between that idea of homelessness and Indigenous issues. There was also some conversations about what requests and negotiations from urban Indigenous people might look like. These requests and demands shifted over the course of the summer, but one of the early demands for from Camp Pekiweiwin in Edmonton was about defunding the police, was about reducing police presence on sort of city streets with an intention that that money would be better used providing social services. By the end of the summer, they had sort of dropped the defund the police argument, although they were very careful to say that the large police budget might be a place to find the money to provide the other things that are necessary here in terms of supportive housing, in terms of addictions treatment, in terms of access to social workers, in terms of access to employment, all of those sorts of questions. And one of the challenges that sort of comes up about that is that as far as it goes, right, if Indigenous issues are a federal government responsibility, then the federal government is the one who's supposed to deal with that as Indigenous issues anyway. But when we talk about homelessness and social disorder like that at a local level, it becomes very much a municipal issue. And that kind of conversation is really sort of challenging because, for example, large cities, and this is the case sort of across the country, often feel like they are being asked to deal with issues that are not their responsibility and that they didn't cause. So, for example, they're being asked to deal with Indigenous reconciliation, and they're like, we didn't sign the treaties. This is not our job, and we're doing the best we can, but we really don't have the resources to solve this problem. So there's that kind of challenge. You will also see, for example, in the responses to something like Camp Pekiweiwin that sort of become very interesting and very illustrative of one of the reasons why these Indigenous issues are so difficult to solve. So there were any number of people whose position on this was, well, obviously these people need help, but not there. So there was sort of some conversation around where this sort of support should go. This is an ongoing conversation in Edmonton, for example, in that Rossdale, where Camp Pekiweiwin is located, is a relatively affluent neighborhood. Homes there are relatively expensive. And there was sort of a push, silently and not so silently, depending on who you talk to, for example, say, well, we should move those people who need services to Boyle Street, to Macaulay, to Central McDougall, all relatively poorer neighborhoods sort of north of Edmonton's downtown, and that already, for example, deal with a lot of those issues. So, for example, those three neighborhoods have almost all of the available safe injection sites, safe consumption sites in the city. They already deal with large numbers of people living in poverty. They already deal with large percentages of the homeless population. They have the vast majority of homeless shelters in the city. All of those things are true, and there's sort of this push about, well, really, it doesn't make sense to put these people in sort of these neighborhoods where they don't really fit and they can't really get access to the services. And there was a lot of sort of criticism of that sort of response, that it was basically a way of saying, I don't want to have to see it. And some conversations about, for example, what reconciliation would really look like, and whether that means that certain people, primarily upper middle class, white, English speaking, that sort of thing, could just ignore these problems. And so this is one of the challenges that we deal with when we talk about social hierarchies. You'll see this conversation if you talk about racial hierarchies, about gender hierarchies, about sexual and gender minorities, all of those sorts of pieces, is that it is an example of privilege to be able to ignore an issue. So, for example, if you are an upper middle class white person and you wish to ignore environmental issues, you have a better time doing it than people who are, for example, living in environments that are right now being damaged by climate change or environmental degradation or pollution. So the ability to ignore that issue is a statement of privilege. And in a lot of ways, reconciliation is this task that involves seeing other people and seeing them as humans, as people. And that's a really challenging thing to ask of people. I'm not saying it's not valuable. I'm not saying we shouldn't do it. I'm just saying that it's not a simple thing, especially when, in a lot of ways, people's lives are more comfortable without that, right? to have to see sort of people who are struggling and living in tents because they're not sort of safe and affordably housed can kind of make you uncomfortable when you go home to your $1.5 million 5-bedroom house. And if you don't like dealing with that discomfort, then it's quite normal for people to sort of say, well, I want those issues dealt with somewhere over there. And that's part of the challenge. There was also sort of some challenges. If you were really following the news, you recognize that there were sort of two homeless encampments in Edmonton over the summer. There was one at Camp Pekiweiwin, and then also one in Wilbur McIntyre Park next to the old Strathcona Farmers Market, if you are familiar with that. And part of the conversation there was to sort of suggest that, well, yes, we didn't feel welcome at the other one because we're not Indigenous, and to sort of talk about challenges of reconciliation and how much integration and openness it is necessary or expected for Indigenous groups to have, right? There's a lot of challenges about that that are quite common to many other forms of sort of social stratification, right? So, for example, how open and aware does the women's movement need to be of men's concerns and feelings about the women's movement? And that's sort of one of the challenges is that how aware of non-Indigenous people's feelings do Indigenous people need to be when they are making their requests and they are sort of stating what they need and they're making calls for what reconciliation looks like from their perspective. Normally, when I do video lectures, I'm trying to give you sort of more facts and information, but I sort of talking about Camp Pekiweiwin mostly to offer people some sort of contemporary things to think about and ways of looking at this issue because it's not at all as simple. And one of the challenges when we look, for example, at Indigenous issues in a contemporary context, is that they don't fit neatly into one government's area of responsibility or another. They sort of float between a variety of different areas and sort of responsibilities, ranging from the personal to the sort of government to sort of the large scale to the small scale. And all of those things are important. And really, we get the best results if all of those things are working in concert. But there's no sort of strategic position or agreement about what that needs to look like on either side, actually. There's nothing from the sort of Western settler colonialist government, if that's how you want to describe it, about what reconciliation should look like. And then, because there are so many Indigenous groups and Indigenous people across the country who have such different experiences and such different perspectives, there's no clear idea on that side either. So, in a lot of ways, it all has to be done in this sort of really slow case by case basis, which is probably a good thing long term, but it does mean that there are a lot of concerns for a lot of people, for example, about how slow it's moving, about how difficult this process is to sort of get anywhere, because there's all of this sort of negotiation and consensus building that needs to get done first. All right. That is not all we could say about contemporary Indigenous issues, but it is all I am going to say this semester, at least for this unit about contemporary Indigenous issues.